All right, Seth, what's up? I'm happy to give you a platform because I know you don't have many, or they are reducing in number. What's going on, Seth? Why has the Babylon Bee been censored by Twitter?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer to that is just that we poke holes in the popular narrative. We do what satirists, what comedians, what humorists are supposed to do. Instead of promoting the popular narrative, we're attacking it. You know, we're challenging it. We're pushing back on it. So instead of propping it up when you're trying to knock it down, that's when you generate some attention, some negative attention. It's, you know, the people who are trying to advance that narrative get really bothered by that. So we tell jokes they don't like. That's the short answer. But, you know, they've got all these creative ways of enforcing their terms so that they can kind of knock down one side and keep the other side standing while still making it look like they're being neutral. And it's just because they've baked their ideology into their terms, right? You know, they have all this hateful conduct stuff in there that is just gender ideology baked into the terms. And if you disagree with it, it means you're hateful. Well, you know, the majority of Americans disagree with it. And so, you know, there needs to be a discussion that's had about this, not just a silencing of one side.
And what is the tweet? And look, I have been effectively censored on social media platforms, not on Twitter, but, for example, on Facebook. And the notice that you get when you are censored is very vague, very abstract. Sometimes it's even difficult. It's hard to find out exactly which tweet or which post was the offending item. And if you can identify, you get very loose response, if a response at all, about what was offensive or what got you red flagged. So what was it with the Babylon Bee specifically that you know of that drew the target of the censor?
Well, I think in this case, it's clear enough. I mean, there was a real story out there. USA Today published a story where they named Rachel Levine one of their Women of the Year. They had selected a number of women, not just one, that they named Women of the Year. Rachel Levine was one of them, which we find absurd. And we consider that misgendering. And so, you know, we did a joke of it, a parody of it, where we named Rachel Levine our Man of the Year. So the Babylon Bee did its own pick satirically and picked Rachel Levine for Man of the Year. They consider that misgendering. They consider misgendering hate speech. And so, you know, what they're saying is, as long as we delete the tweet, we can stay on Twitter. But in deleting the tweet, we have to admit, they have this language on there that by deleting the tweet, you know, you agree that you engaged in hateful conduct. And we're like, come on, we're not going to do that. You know, it's as absurd as trying to force us to say that 2 + 2 makes 5. And if we don't agree with that, then we can't tweet. Well, we don't agree.
And you're not on Twitter. How have the other social media platforms handled you?
We've had similar problems on the other ones. I mean, Facebook has been the worst. We've been in incitement to violence has been one of the things we've been flagged for. Obviously, misinformation. We get fact checked to death over there. So Facebook's been working with third-party fact checkers since like 2018, and they're constantly rating our stories false. Absurd stuff. I mean, it started with one about how we had said that CNN had purchased an industrial-sized washing machine to spin the news in before publishing it, and that was one of the first fact checks. They rate it false. And it's just the most absurd story in the world. So, you know, we've been dealing with that kind of stuff for a long time, and we often get dinged. We'll be told that, you know, we have to take down a post, or that if we continue to post misinformation or hate speech, we're not going to be able to stay on the platform. And usually, if we make enough noise about it and it gets out there in the media, there's something that happens where they turn around and they apologize for how they handled it. They admit that satire is different from hate speech or whatever. But they're really trying to update their terms to make sure that even satire has to advance their narratives instead of go against them. And they're doing this with these policies against punching down. What they say is punching down. They consider that hate speech under the guise of comedy. So there's a lot we're dealing with to try to just stay on these platforms.
Yeah, you know, there are so many different layers to getting caught in the fly trap of censorship for you. For a guy like me who is offering opinion, commentary, and journalism, they're going to be able to live under the pretense of misinformation, telling people Will is giving you false information or, according to them, accurate information. But then you have this whole other filter where you're not trying to give accurate information. You are satirical. So how can they hold you to a standard of misinformation if the whole point is you're very aware there's not a industrial-sized washing machine inside the buildings of CNN? You're making a satirical point. I don't even understand how they would write a guideline that allows them to shut you down.
Well, what they're supposedly doing, what they claim to be doing, is looking out for all these poor people who are duped by us. You know, the the maybe naive idiots out there who read a satire story like that and think that it's true, and this is just damaging, this disinformation that it can get out there. And what they've actually tried to do, what the New York Times tried to do, is actually malign our motives and say that we're trying to mislead people on purpose. They said we were trafficking in misinformation under the guise of satire on purpose, which is just an absurd claim. They had nothing to back it up, and so they actually had to retract that statement. We threatened to sue them, and they retracted that. But, this is what they're trying to do, is suggest that we're misleading people on purpose. But here's the thing. Jokes are believable sometimes, Will. It's like they're believable because there is truth to them. And
right.
When you're doing a satirical story, obviously you're dealing with made up details, like the names of the characters are made up and the scenario is made up. But you really are making a point with the joke, and it's rooted in the truth, or else the joke isn't going to be funny at all. So this idea that our jokes have to be so divorced from reality that no one could possibly believe they were true is just an unrealistic expectation to place on a satirist, when that's what satire does, is it speaks the truth through humor and irony, using fabricated details, but an underlying, bedrock of truth that you're advancing.
To your knowledge, have there been any other comedians, comedy sites, satirists who have received the same level of scrutiny and censorship?
To my knowledge, no. The Onion has been fact-checked similar to us, but not with the same approach. The fact checks of the Onion are handled very differently. They usually, when Snopes does a fact check of the Onion, they say, this is the funniest satire site on the internet. You should know that. Why are you thinking that this is true? They're great. They're satire. And then with us, it's like, danger, disinformation. This outlet is trying to dupe people. Don't buy into it. So, the approach is very different. In terms of like deplatforming and stuff like that, no, I can't think of another comedian or satire outlet that's dealt with it to the extent that we have.
How would you describe The Bee? I know that Wikipedia describes The Bee as a Christian conservative comedy website. You, in your original answer to me, described The Bee as a comedy site pushing back on the popular narrative. How would you describe your brand or your niche?
I love that question. It's a great question because not many people ask me that. What the left will try to do is position everything that they do as just the regular version of something. The Onion is a satire site. It's not a left-wing satire site. It's just satire. And the Babylon Bee is the right-wing or far-right or insane extremist version of the Onion. They're just trying to tip the balance in their favor just by caricaturing you right off the bat. I don't think that comedy should fall into those buckets of like right and left. I mean, we're conservatives generally. We have conservatives and libertarians on our staff. Christians and Catholics, but we're not trying to describe ourselves as like a conservative or right wing satire site. We just happen to be conservatives who are doing satire, and we like to make jokes that poke at our own side. I think that generally, like I was saying before in my earlier comments that you just quoted, the job of the satirist, the job of the comedian, the court jester, right, is to punch up and make jokes at the powers that be, the power structures that be, the people who are in the positions of power, scrutinizing and examining what they're doing, holding them up to mockery and ridicule when they deserve it, and pointing out their hypocrisy and so on. And we're doing that because the left is in power. The left has all the cultural and institutional power right now in our society. And so when we push back on them and make fun of their stuff, we are fulfilling that role. It doesn't matter if we're right wing or not. We just happen to be the ones who are pushing back on the powers that be and what they're trying to shove down our throats. In the way they're acting like authoritarians and tyrants with all of this stuff. So, I think that any comedian or satirist should be doing that, and it shouldn't really matter what lines you fall down on in terms of, your political views, where you fall on that spectrum. Yeah,
if I think back through at least the modern history of comedy, the through line might be that most comedians and most famous people, most Hollywood actors, most media institutions are liberal, but they would have at least had the reason to say we're pushing back on the dominant narrative. Richard Pryor would have said, I'm pushing back on the dominant culture, which he could have described, I think, in the 1970s as predominantly Christian and conservative. Bill Maher might have felt the same way in the early 2000s. He might have had that ideological cover. But what's odd is now, as you point out, the dominant cultural force, and for that matter, political force, resides on the left. And so what we've seen is this weird thing where those that are truly comedians, those who really see their role as pushing back on the dominant, maybe like a Bill Maher, maybe like South Park, find, hey, there's this fertile ground. The fertile ground is we can make fun of the left. We can make fun of COVID censorship. We can, and nonsense. We can make fun of all of this fertile ground. And then there's the vast majority of comedians, which I do think it is the vast majority, like, say, Stephen Colbert, who seem to have become something else. They become not the court jester who makes fun of the king or makes fun of the dominant power, but the court jester who holds the megaphone and reinforces the message of the king.
Yep. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a reason that they're doing that. You know, there's tremendous pressure on comedians. When you're out there telling jokes, you're literally tiptoeing through a minefield at this point. Everybody wants a safe space. Nobody wants to be offended by anything. And by the way, they won't necessarily be genuinely offended. They will pretend to be offended because you've said something that they don't like. And their outrage is how they control you and manipulate you, because if they form together as a mob and come after you, they know they can get you canceled. And so this cancel culture thing, to their credit, you know, there are some people on the left who are pushing back on that. Bill Maher, who you mentioned, you know, he's one of these guys who has been heavily critical of the cancel culture and the way that it's constricting comedians and causing them to basically muzzle themselves. I mean, like a comedian like Jerry Seinfeld won't even go on a college campus anymore. He won't go near one because it's just not. It's like hostile territory. Jokes are like, they're viewed as dangerous there, dangerous and harmful. And you just got to be so careful that you're not going to offend the wrong people. And this is the really interesting thing, you know, when you talk about these power structures. And I like to make this point, you know, it's important to understand that the people who have both the will and the power to punish you for simply making fun of them, those are not marginalized people. You're not punching down when you make fun of them. If they have that will and that power, they're tyrants, they're oppressors. They're actually the ones that are above you, that can squish you with their thumb if they want to. And so, you know, I think the comedian's job is to really push back on that. And the ones who do it, they like you said, the fertile ground is all over the place. I mean, Dave Chappelle has done this very successfully. There are comedians who are thriving right now in this environment, and the effort to cancel them is only making them more popular. So I wish that more people would get emboldened and step into that arena and say, hey, look, you know, our job is to push back on this stuff.
Yeah, and guys like Dave Chappelle would not describe themselves as conservative, much less right-wing. Neither would Bill Maher. So what do you think is driving this? You know, you used, and I know the B does use in your social media post, and hey, not for nothing, but what you guys do is absolutely genius. And The Onion at its height was not even capable of reaching the level of cultural relevance that you are reaching right now, because there is so much absurdity at the top of the power structure and so few willing to point and go, wait, that's insane. So, you know, the moment has met your talent in a way that I think you have done something that really very few have been willing or capable of doing in the past. But those that will, you're not alone, but you're there at the forefront, along with the Dave Chappelles and the Bill Mahers of the world on this, would not describe themselves as conservative or right-wing. So in your estimation, Seth, what's driving it? I mean, if you and I had talked probably 7 years ago, we would have said two things. It's being driven by left-wing ideology, and there is very few, I think we might have been able to agree on this, very few talented conservative comedians. It just wasn't working. And I think the times have changed. The moment has changed. But is it still left-wing ideology that's driving this, driving the censorship, driving the fear? Or is it looser? Like, it's about what you said, the popular narrative, the current thing that seems to be what we all have to subscribe to?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, yeah, they've gained some control. They've gained an extensive amount of control over our institutions. So, you know, they own entertainment. They basically have owned comedy for a long time. They own the universities. They own the government at the moment. They own everything. So we're in a position where you know, there's more and more radical, further left views that are being kind of pushed on people by a very vocal but actual minority of the people. But they're vocal and they hold positions of power. And so, you know, I think that once they get that power, they're using that power to their advantage. You know, what happened with the social media is something that's really interesting that's impacted us, because that's where we drive most of our traffic. Is, you know, you had Donald Trump get elected, and Facebook was taking a lot of heat for that. You know, they were getting raked over the coals by people on the left for playing a role in allowing conservative media to flourish, conservative voices to flourish. They weren't doing enough to clamp down on misinformation, and they couldn't let that kind of thing happen again. So that's why in 2018, you had this big push to start getting these fact checkers in there to protect their power. Because they realize, they have all this control, they have all this power, they own Facebook, they own Twitter, they own Instagram, they own all of these things, but they weren't using these tools to the full extent that they could to protect themselves. And so now they've started to ramp that up a little bit, and it's only gotten worse over the last few years. So I think it's about power and control, and now it's turning into a thing about submission, where rather than just deleting our tweet, Twitter is saying they want us to bend the knee and say we actually did engage in hateful conduct and delete it ourselves. I mean, that goes so far beyond just them moderating what's on their platform.
Yeah, so let me see if I understand what you're saying completely and accurately, because I wonder, do I think left-wing ideology is behind this? Yes, but there's something else going on, and perhaps that something else resides even on the other side of left-wing ideology, and it's simple, and it's about brute power. But when we move so quickly from whatever the current thing is, and the current thing moves from a COVID vaccine to a Ukrainian flag in your profile to, I'm really shocked that in the past couple of days it hasn't become, and I think Matt Walsh made a joke about this, but alopecia awareness, after the Will Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith incident, Chris Rock incident. But the current thing moves so quickly. And it seems like social media, and for that matter, corporate America, because we've seen what's happened with Disney this week, moves so quickly with it that what you're telling me is, yeah, it's left wing, but even behind that, it's just simple people, not simple people, but people simply moving towards power, just using the current thing to exercise power.
Well, to exercise power for a purpose. And I think that, the exercise of that power is for the purpose of preserving and promoting and foisting on everybody these progressive ideas. I mean, that's why that's why they're exercising the power that way. I mean, that's the example that I gave about the election. I think it's a good one. Facebook, for the most part, was trying to stay fairly hands off and stay fairly neutral. And they got so much pressure put on them by Democrats, by people on the left, to do more. They had to do more to curb the spread of misinformation and clamp down on that. And so, the power was for a purpose. It was to silence these voices that were effectively taking away their power, but also undermining their message. The message right now, this big thing that's going on, the big story right now is the Disney stuff, everything that's happening with Disney and the indoctrination and the grooming, as people on the right will call it, that Disney is engaging in and trying to put sexual messages and conduct and content into these shows that are designed for children, and people are pushing back on that. But this is it's them using their power, their influence, their reach. Nobody has the reach and the influence that Disney has. Disney Plus has more subscribers than the Daily Wire is ever going to have. And so, they're using it to the full extent of their ability.
And why? Do you think it is because Disney believes that, or they're operating out of fear of their employees, or they're just trying to keep up with the current thing? That's a lot of market share. That's a lot of decades of brand building that they're willing to burn in pursuit of whatever is the current thing. And the current thing is trans issues and these sexual orientation, gender identity issues in kindergarten. Why are they so willing to burn that capital?
All of those things boil down. Well, all those things boil down to, the way I describe the left is it's not necessarily that they have their own values. They have anti-values. Whatever our values are, they're opposed to them, and they want to tear them down. And our values are a threat to their values. Freedom of speech itself is a threat to their values. It's not that they have a problem with hate speech. They just hate speech. They don't like when people disagree with them and push back on them and challenge them. And so once they get power, then it's like, okay, well, now we can silence everybody. Now we can ban people who disagree with us. We can use it, to make sure that everybody has to agree with us. They don't really care if you feel the right way, like if you actually feel like Rachel Levine is a woman. They just want you to only verbally affirm it. You have to conform. You have to either affirm it or shut up. And that's both a power play. At the same time, it's just them, wanting their ideology to be dominant and unchallenged.
What does that mean for you? You bought the Bee, I believe, 2018? The Bee was founded in 2016. You came along in 2018, 19, I believe. And I got to think, you didn't simply want to build a business on social media. If you did, I'm sorry. That's looking less bright than when you put your money down to buy the bee. But what does that mean for you? Because on one hand, you've got this fertile ground that we talk about where you get to own comedy along with some very big names like Dave Chappelle. But on the other, you need to have a platform in order to get out your content. So what does that mean for the future of the bee?
Well, that was one of the main concerns. It's the concern that Adam, the founder of the Babylon Bee, had when he sold the site to me. It was that censorship is coming, and I don't want to get the rug pulled out from underneath me. And so I saw it a little bit differently. I saw it to some extent as an opportunity to be kind of on the forefront of this battle for ideas, for the truth, for comedy itself, for the right to make jokes. And I realized, I was hopeful that the battle itself would draw a lot of attention to these issues. And if there were people who were bold and unwilling to back down on the front lines, they would embolden other people. So I wanted to get into the fray and get involved in that fight. We do need a platform. You're absolutely right about that. So one of the first things that we did when I took over was to make sure that we had a subscription model in place where people could subscribe and support us directly. And you can do that on the website. You can sign up, become either a basic or premium subscriber, and provide financial support so that when we lose these platforms and we lose all the traffic that comes with them, we still have revenue and we can still keep going because we have a lot of expenses. We have a large team of writers and graphic designers and marketers and developers and everything. We're a business. So, we've reached out to our audience, and our audience has been very supportive. But then in terms of reaching people with our content, once you get taken off these platforms, there's not much that can be done. That's why I'm looking to either, hopeful that either Congress or the courts will come up with a solution for this, because as it stands right now, this is a major speech problem. The rights of these private companies to just do whatever they want. Well, that may be the case under current law. A lot of judges have ruled that way. Should it be that way? I don't think so.
What are you looking for from Congress or the courts? Do you want to see an antitrust action? Do you want to see these things broken up? Do you want to see government control of the speech on these platforms? How do we control a bunch of private companies who subscribe to the current narrative and censor anybody who dares step outside the boundaries?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think that some things could be done to simply say, look, the Section 230 immunity that these companies enjoy is great, but maybe it should be conditioned on political neutrality, viewpoint neutrality, where, you get the benefit of immunity you get if you're politically neutral, just like you get the benefit of tax exemption being a nonprofit if you don't endorse political candidates. The minute you start doing that, you disqualify yourself from the benefit. So it's not really a punishment. It's just a benefit that comes with qualifying conditions. I think something like that could work. There's some legislation that's been drafted. There's a bill that was out in Texas that just got shot down by a judge, but they're appealing it, that basically made it unlawful for these platforms to discriminate based on viewpoint and deplatform people. And if they did do that, then it gave people the ability to sue these companies, not for money to bankrupt them, but just for an injunction to get back onto the platform. So there's been some legislation that's been crafted along those lines where you don't have a large, convoluted, expensive government regulatory body that's overseeing speech. Nobody wants that. No conservative wants that. We just want to protect free speech, and we want to, and I think that can be accomplished. Justice Thomas was talking about common carrier doctrine and how that might apply to these social media companies, where you have AT&T, for example. They're a conduit of your messages that you're sending to other people. They're not the speaker of those messages, and they're not allowed lawfully to discriminate over who gets to say anything on their communications platform. If Twitter and Facebook are just treated as conduits, as common carriers like that, then they can't engage in discrimination. And so it's not a First Amendment issue. It's not a First Amendment issue with AT&T. Why should it be a First Amendment issue with Twitter or Facebook? So there's big conversations around those things and rebuttals that you can go back and forth all day, but ultimately I think something's got to give.
So let's go back to where you nodded along for just one moment when I said, I think as recently as definitely 7 years ago, 5 years ago perhaps, there seemed to be so little talent in conservative comedy. It was either because there was a perception that conservatives just aren't cool and funny, or because of the shift in the dominant power structures within our culture and politics. Why do you think that's changed? What did change? Why is it now all of a sudden it is left-wingers. It is Stephen Colbert, who've lost all relevance, and in my estimation, really not even a semblance of humor. And now, if you want to find something funny and even slightly rebellious, you have to look to some of the names that we've talked about in this conversation.
Well, so, I mean, if you go to a comedy show or you watch some of these late night guys, so much of the time they're going for applause. Like they're preaching to a choir that's like cheering them on for what they're saying with affirmation rather than like amusement. They should be going for amusement, but they're going for affirmation. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like, I think that's one of the issues is that comedians, you mentioned, I think you used the word a megaphone, you know, they become mouthpieces for politicians and progressive movements and ideas. And so instead of poking holes at the popular narrative, like the comedian should be doing, they're promoting it. And that's not funny. You know, like people want to hear it challenged. They want to hear the popular narrative challenged. They also, by the way, want to laugh at themselves. You know, this idea, so many people, you know, the left has made it very popular for people to want safe spaces and to be so offended by jokes. And, you know, look at Will Smith charging the stage to slap somebody who made a joke about his wife. You know, it used to be that people could like actually sit there and take a joke, and the comedians would go and pick on people in the audience and you'd laugh at yourself. That's a healthy exercise. Believe it or not, there are still a lot of people who aren't so emotionally damaged and fragile that they can't take a joke. And they understand, you know, they really enjoy comedy shows and going there and even laughing at themselves and hearing inappropriate jokes. And I'm not talking about like gross, inappropriate sexual content or something. I'm just talking about like inappropriate in the sense that someone's the butt of the joke. Someone's being made fun of. And stereotypes are being advanced in these jokes because they're funny. They're rooted in the truth. It's a healthy thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not coming from a place of hate. You know, comedians need to go back to simply saying, is this funny when they're writing a joke? Is it funny? Instead, they're asking themselves all kinds of questions about whether or not it's advancing a narrative they want to advance, and are they going to offend somebody that's going to try to cancel.
All right, last thing. So where do you go? If it's fertile ground, but you need a platform, we talked about the fact that most of comedy is somewhat irrelevant, and that would include, for example, sketch comedy. That would include, for example, Saturday Night Live. Where do you go with the B? Where is the fertile ground plus the platform for you to have cultural relevance, but also real entrepreneurial business opportunity?
Well, right now there's nowhere to go beyond the main platforms. I mean, there are alternatives. There are great functional alternatives out there: Parler, Gab, Getter, you know, you name it. There's other platforms. You don't get the same reach though. They are echo chambers. You know, if you want cultural relevance, if you want to be engaged, you know, we have people like Joe Rogan and Elon Musk interacting with our tweets when we're on Twitter. If we're not on Twitter, we don't get that kind of interaction from people like that. You're sidelined, you're marginalized, you're removed from those discussions. This is the public square of the modern age: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. You know, so the fight is to stay on these platforms. I think that the fight needs to be to say, you look, you know, ultimately, whether we have a right to be on them right now, we should. Let's talk about what should be the case, and then work our way towards that goal. Because ultimately, yeah, we won't have a platform. We won't be relevant. If we do get deplatformed all the way across the board on these things, you know, it'll be a fight to come back. It'll require a legal change. It'll require the law being changed or the courts weighing in on this to give us access back to these platforms. Because listen to this. I mean, like, the left is not going to leave these platforms for some free speech alternative. Like I said, it's not hate speech they have a problem with. They just hate speech. So they're not going to leave for a free speech alternative. They're going to stay on these platforms. They need to be forced, basically, to tolerate the fact that other people have opinions other than their own, and they're allowed to voice them. Wow, that's
fascinating. That is a fascinating thing you said here at the end, because I think for many it is go create parallel systems, go create parallel social media platforms. I'm in my head thinking, go create an alternative Saturday Night Live, Seth, and go find your platform that will host you, and behind a subscription paywall and on a hosting service that won't censor you. Go find your audience. But I do think you make...
I don't know if that's the answer. You know, like this whole idea of a parallel economy where we're all existing in our own little worlds. You know, the conservatives have their credit cards and the liberals have their credit cards. I mean, is that really what we want? Is that how it should be? You know, maybe it's what ends up happening, and it has to happen. But I don't know that.
No, you make a good point about people. This is a United States of America, and at the very minimum, you're supposed to be forced to tolerate the existence of other people's voices. And that's worth fighting for on the platforms that exist today instead of having to create new ones. I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, if we're going to force people to do anything, let's force them to acknowledge the fact that freedom is real, and it's real here in America. Really good.
All right, Seth, best of luck, man. The country needs the Babylon Bee in this comedy, so I hope we can find it. All right.
Thanks,
Good
man.
luck. Thanks, Seth. I really appreciate it.